Mhm.
You'll know. Andrew, you have a new, oh, we're live. Oh, good. We're live. Hope everyone's doing well. Welcome to the Environmental Civic Research Cafe. Great to have you here. I'm Brian Brady from Youth Engage Consulting. I have some fabulous guests. We're going to get started in about 1 minute. But before we get started, if you are jumping on right now, if you could in the chat, just let us know your name and your affiliation and what brought you to the Civic Research Cafe today. We needed background music for this part, didn't we? I'm looking for comments. I don't see people introducing themselves if you're on. Although I have to say, I suspect most people will join in the next couple minutes. Vince Meldrum, good to see you, Vince. Martha, good to see you. All right. Well, in interest of time, 1 hour is not a lot of time to dive into these topics. So I'm gonna kick this off, and we'll keep reading about the people in the room with us as we go here. So I am again, once again, Brian Brady. I am a consultant at Youth Engage. I'm also a board member of Earth Force. To me, one of the best civic education organizations in the country, one of the best kept secrets. Later at the end of this amazing panel, I'll throw a little donate link into the chat, and you all can show your love and appreciation for one of the best nonprofit civic groups in the country. But until that time, we're going to just dive into some really interesting conversation with three brilliant researchers that I'm excited to talk to. So we'll do about 30 minutes of conversation amongst ourselves. If you have questions, feel free to put the questions in the comment section, and Haley will filter those questions, and we'll ask a lot of them in the final 30 minutes. So just introductions here first. Really excited to have three great panelists. Katie Hedrick Taylor is associate professor. I'm scrolling down here. Associate professor of learning sciences and human development at the College of Education at the University of Washington. I could go on and on about each of these professors, but we're going to keep it short so we can get right into the conversation. Andrew Nalani, Dr. Andrew Nalani is assistant professor, Department of Human and Organizational Development, and a Jackie Bezos researcher in residence at the Bezos Family Foundation. And Joe Kahne, a longtime friend, is a Dutton Presidential Professor for Education Policy and Politics and director of the Civic Engagement Research Group at the University of California, Riverside. Each of these folks have done some just really compelling research. So I encourage you to look up each of them and look at their body of work. Today, though, we're going to focus on environmental civic research, but really the underlying theme is young people and civic engagement and the intersection of environmental and civic learning. Together, this session will highlight the insights on how to design learning spaces that elevate youth voice and build civic skills and connect to real community challenges. Each of these researchers has a unique take and insight on this, so really excited to hear what they have to say. Katie, let's start with you. Let's start with the question, what does it actually take for young people to have meaningful opportunities to shape the communities they live in? And I hear you might have a slide for this one to help us
I
out
think
on
there's a
this too.
slide. Yes, thank you. Thanks, Haley. Thanks, Haley, and thank you, Brian, so much for the invitation. And I'm so happy to be here. I've been reading Joe's work for so long, and I'm so happy to be in conversation with him, and so grateful to meet Andrew and be in conversation with you too, Andrew. So this is a really special treat for me, and this is my favorite thing to talk about. So happy to pitch in my 2 cents. So when I think about this question around opportunities for young people to shape communities, I'm always returning back to an idea that was proposed by Bill Tate. This idea of geography of opportunity. I'm a place-based researcher, so I'm always thinking spatially and about sort of what the on the ground characteristics and dimensions are that really set up the conditions for young people to do transformational work in their communities. So I always return to this idea of geography of opportunity. It really simply is just to have a sort of clear-eyed accounting of what are the facilities and resources, the available people and organizations, the educational programs that really may exist in some unlikely places in your communities, and how these dimensions are connected and sometimes really disconnected for young people. So I always think about that. And then Nicole Pinkard, who is at Northwestern now, and I think is Brian's neighbor, has really taken that idea to talk about opportunity landscaping. And so this is really looking at, this geography of opportunity, but seeing it as a learning landscape that has been really, it doesn't feel like it at sometimes, but it's been intentionally designed that way. There have been decision-making processes, there have been design choices that put this geography of opportunity, together for better or for worse, for young people to access. And so Nicole Pinkard and her colleagues are really thinking about what does it mean to, to do this sort of audit and then really be intentional about reconnecting and redesigning our communities such that young people have support to do really important work. So, that could look like, and I feel like this is really the case all over in all of our communities, but do young people need better transportation options to get to the programming? Do young people need paid internships or scholarships? Do the locations that we're trying to do this work really support the staffing that you need and the infrastructure that you need to give young people the best opportunities to engage? And so I'll wrap this up in like a more clear example, but from recent work that I've done that's existed at the intersection of a public library, several public schools with public school teachers from various high schools. We worked with the Historical Society of mostly old timers, and then several civic leaders. And this group was really invested to, support young people to create basically a new community experience for people, telling stories that had not been told in a long time, were forgotten, again, intentionally. And so the thing that really mattered for that group to really coalesce was a clear so what that really articulated the work that was going to, show people that it mattered for their daily lives in a realistic material way. So I think that so what isn't just important for getting folks on board to sort of play and collaborate with you, but it's also important for young people to be able to talk about the work in a way that makes them feel like they have trajectories that sort of can lead from the work so that they can have more learning opportunities. But this could look like, college applications or just talking to media or posting things on social media. Having that clear so what is really essential for getting all kinds of stakeholders on board to do authentic, I think, community engagement work with youth. I'm probably at time. I could go on and on about this, but we can come back and I'll let somebody else jump in.
Yeah, Katie, I'll pass it to Andrew, but I'm just hearing if I'm a high school teacher of social studies or if I'm a youth worker in a community organization, that the why you're doing this, mapping your community, starting with where they're at is what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And the geography of opportunity. I love that phrase. Andrew, your work covers many of these same areas and some new ones. How would you add to what Katie's articulating?
Yeah, Katie, thank you for this perspective on geographies of opportunities, and um, I had a lot. I was quietly cheering yes, yes, yes.
Yay! Thanks, Andrew.
I come to this work as a former youth worker, a scholar, an advisor across philanthropy, academia, community, school context, and I also am informed by lived experiences of having grown up in high control learning environments myself, and seeing what the alternative is. And over the last 15 years, I have honed my work to really understand a fundamental mechanism. So instead of looking at a specific program that everyone has to adopt, I've been asking myself, what are the developmental and contextual drivers or mechanisms that support young people's contribution? And I've honed in on this idea of youth-adult partnerships, which are intergenerational collaborations where there is mutual trust and respect between adults and young people. There is a sense of joint decision making. There is a sense of tackling a community issue together. And even though we have 40 years of evidence that tells us that this way of working with young people is not only developmentally aligned with where young people are at, but it's also effective for community and adult development. This is still an innovation rather than a norm. And when I ask myself what does it take to have these opportunities, I think really being clear about the developmental mechanism, you thought of partnerships as a developmental mechanism, and doubling down on that is important. Young people are ready developmentally. The science tells us young people are ready to take risks. They want to contribute. They value peer relationships. They are sensitive to issues of status and respect. And when we don't design for that, they are not motivated to contribute to their communities. And so my work has really, and building on scholars who came before me, Chef Zeldin's work on youth adult partnerships has really been key. Brian Christen's work has been key. Bianca Baldridge, who looks at the adults who work with young people and their occupational conditions matter. But I think usually when we think about youth contribution, we are focusing on evaluating a single program or evaluating outcomes. But I think really being clear on what needs to happen to make the thing happen. What is the fundamental mechanism? And one of those that I look at, youth adult partnerships. These are central drivers. They are not always equally distributed, that idea of partnership. Adults have varying levels of capacity to engage in youth adult partnerships. And from my own work, wherever there's been a case of implementing these kinds of partnerships, sustaining them has been a true challenge. And so, and I'll speak about this later on, I've been challenging the research field to lift the gaze away from individual young people or adult mindsets to actually consider the organizational conditions and the ideological or the cultural conditions in which this work happens. So I will use that as a teaser to say the science tells us young people are ready. And a central mechanism that we need to focus on is youth adult partnerships. And I'll be happy to share a little bit later on organization ideologically what gets in the way of those partnerships.
Great, thanks, Andrew. So, we're talking about the geography of opportunity and the importance of youth adult partnerships. And we also know we're going to get into sort of what are the barriers in a second. And Joe, you've seen a lot of different programs over your years of research. And what do you think are the key factors for meaningful youth engagement in the community and shaping their community?
Sure. Well, first, thank you, Brian, and to Earth Force for creating this forum, and it's great to be here with Katie and Andrew, and with the folks who are engaging, and looking forward to those comments and questions. My background, as you were saying, Brian, is largely in civic ed generally. So trying to understand the way educators, both in school and out of school, social media, and other factors develop young people's understandings, commitments, and activities. And then more recently, which makes me particularly excited about this event, I've been part of National Academy of Sciences is doing an initiative, we have a committee called Educating for Thriving in a Changing Climate, which has really allowed me to connect with some folks. And I see some of those folks are here at the event, which is fabulous. To think more deeply and specifically about educating in relation to the changing climate. I'll make a couple broad comments, and maybe we can delve into their particulars afterwards. In terms of what experiences matter, and I think the literature is pretty clear, both around learning about climate as well as civic learning generally. Big picture, that knowledge and action are really two separate dimensions. And it doesn't mean they aren't related, but that we sometimes assume that if we give kids knowledge or give them opportunities to develop deeper understandings, that it will promote both understandings and action. And likewise, we sometimes imagine that if we engage young people or give them opportunities to be engaged in activities, that it will deepen their knowledge. And I would say a big takeaway from the research on this is that that link is often not there, which doesn't mean you pick either knowledge or action. It probably means you have to do both. But it does mean you can't assume that if we deepen someone's understanding, it's going to lead them to do something. And similarly, often you can do stuff without really deepening your understanding. So I think that's one big thing to think about. Another big thing to think about is that often when we're working with young people around civic engagement, and I would say around engagement with climate issues in particular, that it's helpful to think about this as a form of identity development. Mm-hmm. That yes, they're going to do something specific, but the long-term takeaway in part is whether or not they're integrating that set of activities into who they are. Mm-hmm. And this comes out of a lot of work. You know, you were talking about movements and things like that, Brian. When you ask who actually gets involved in movements and why they do it, it's not that they go through some cognitive analysis. It's that they say, I'm the kind of person who does something. When there's a problem, I get involved. Or when there's a problem on this issue that I care about, I get involved. And so that's a piece of what we're trying to, I think, develop or help young people develop as we work with them. I'll mention three things that are often very important for identity development. One is knowing who else is doing it. So it's not that we're going to ask a 12-year-old to start up their own organization. And there are some 12-year-olds who do it. And Katie mentioned college applications can look great. If at 16, you created your own whatever. But the reality is that's not the way most people are going to get involved. And so one really important thing is, can we help people know about organizations that do things they care about? And that's important, not just because they might get involved with that organization and, you know, have greater efficacy, but it's also because it can help them see a trajectory for a person with this identity to have agency. And that's the last thing that's key to identity. It's very hard to have an identity as a person who gets involved with climate or with anything if you have no sense that you will have any agency when you do it. And so we have to think carefully about that. And then the last thing, and this is shifting gears a little bit, but it builds off that notion of agency, that I think is, it's true for many forms of civic engagement, but it's particularly true when it comes to climate. Not only can we not ask 8-year-olds or 12-year-olds to save the earth, we can't even ask 17-year-olds. The challenges are immense. And so we have to figure out, how do we talk with people in ways that are authentic and accurate, and at the same time help them see pathways that aren't overwhelming? Because I think for all of us, it can easily be overwhelming. And some of that is going to be about coping. But coping is important, right? Especially when you can't solve some things and the climate is already changing. And some of it is going to be about, you know, more what I think you mentioned just at the opening here, Brian, around forms of changing systems. They might be local systems, they might be state systems, they might be international systems. But what can you do that tries to get more to the root of the problem? both things are going to be important, but you can't say, well, if we're not getting to the root of the problem, then what you're doing, doesn't work. Because how is somebody going to do that? Most of us can't. And so I think we've got to think about where on that continuum, we give people opportunities for a sense of agency and how we talk with them about it. I'll stop there. Thank you.
This was a rich first round here. I'm hearing a lot of the old youth worker, nonprofit person who also worked in schools. I'm sitting there like with myself 25 years, 30 years prior, and thinking about takeaways. I'm hearing from Katie, like you have to think about place-based geography, the opportunities in that geography, and I think, Joe, you're hitting on this sense of agency that we have to build that's tied to identity, but also the right sizing of that civic engagement. Andrew, the key is this is this is intergenerational work, right? You have to build the young people and adults working together, and that's part of the process and not a simple process, right? But Katie, let's be real, really effective designed youth civic engagement spaces are rare for young people. That's not that common that the average student is running across this in a week-to-week basis. They don't have Earthforce in their school. They don't have other teachers doing this. So why is it so hard for us to design spaces and to do this empowering work with regularity? What are the barriers?
I mean, I hope it's okay, Andrew, if I pick up on your youth adult partnerships to kind of get into this question. I do think I absolutely agree that is the sort of primary mechanism by which youth are really engaging in I would say transformational projects in their communities through this sort of relationship with a caring adult, right? And I think one thing that has been really prevalent in some of the projects that we've done is that just because you have a caring adult who also might be an expert in, some specific topic or how to access data or, any sort of expertise, that doesn't necessarily mean that this person is actually a good educator or advocate for youth. So I think that's something that we have to be really honest about. And we have to understand that when we set up these sorts of interactions, and I think Andrew was using the word maybe strategy, mechanism, that in a lot of ways we have to be very careful and clear about what it is we want these caring expert adults to actually be doing. In terms of supporting and advocating with and for young people, because oftentimes, I mean, maybe this is a mistake we've all experienced, but oftentimes within these sorts of youth adult partnerships, some harm is actually restated, right? Or that's not the word I'm using, but that's not the right word, but it's sort of, the harm
Cultural.
the harm that you're trying to undo actually is sort of reinscribed in some of the work. So I think it's a super important dimension. It's a dimension that we rely on a lot. And we also have to be super intentional about how we want those interactions to go. And for the adults that we work with to really believe in youth-led learning opportunities, right? So I think that's just something that we as a field can be more intentional and thoughtful about. And I think part of your question, Brian, is also asking about the sorts of institutional moves that are made or not made that either, open up engagement avenues for young people or create these barriers. And I think just generally as a field, we have to be, I've seen movement in this that's really promising, but I think we have to be very, we have to decide on how we want to talk about knowledge and learning in a more expansive way. And we need a set of, sort of common ways of talking about that really, that really sort of engages funders in exciting ways, that isn't constantly mapping back onto, school outcomes or what can be counted or measured, right? I think we need to keep as a field, developing that vocabulary and that common language to persuade, right, people that this is the learning that matters. When young people are really pushing for change and making change happen, this is the learning that matters for people's lives. So just, continuing to do, I know we're all doing that work, but continue to do that and building this common vocabulary around it is something that I think is going to start sort of tilting the institutional forces, hopefully, in our favor.
You bring up philanthropy, which is a nice segue to put Andrew on the spot.
Yeah.
He has a one-year research fellowship at the Bezos Foundation. Andrew, how are you trying to shake things up over there? How are you trying to shake philanthropy up and advice? Because you think about, I was talking about the classroom and the nonprofit, but then the philanthropy plays a big role in shaping how we design learning spaces as well. And what are your messages and your research pointing to there? And what are the barriers?
We're all learning, and from my research, and building on other scholars, Bianca Badrid's work, Dana Mitra's work, we know that how funding flows tends to have downstream consequences in what happens in the settings where young people are at. So, for example, not just in terms of availability of resources that determine is there time for adults to sustain these relationships, or are we valuing bottom lines that matter? So funding pressures to evaluate against a given outcome. Katie, you are just speaking to this. Most times in this sector, funders want to look at, does this affect test scores? But we're not asking, we're not valuing what other holistic indicators there are, from the social emotional learning to the critical consciousness to sense of well-being as key drivers. On the programmatic side, sometimes that is because our theories of change are not quite as clear. On the funding side, this is where roles like the ones that I'm in that support knowledge translation to influence how decision makers, funders are thinking about what truly happens on the ground matters. In my work, I think one of the really interesting puzzles for me, and I use interesting for lack of a better word, is that even adults who want to work in this way with young people, when they are placed in organizational conditions that do not set them up to be at their best, they are going to fail because of the kinds of pressures that demand that have a downward press, where they say we need to have X number of kids go through the program, or we need these kinds of reporting requirements, and that creates a certain kind of pressure on the adults. My work shows that the adults need to be able to have flexibility in their roles, because when they are boundary spanners, whether it's actually advocating upwards for young people, or wearing the advocate hat at the same time as the program implementation hat, at the same time as the mentorship hat, when that kind of role flexibility is there, they are better able to partner with young people when they have professional development opportunities that actually allow them to draw on their lived wisdom. That also is something that allows them to partner with young people. As a result of policy and funding decisions, we usually find pressures for adults to take very punishment-oriented professional development, and also professional development that delegitimizes their lived experiences from informing the decisions that allow them to be responsive to young people. So a question that comes up for me, and we are exploring this question at the foundation, where we think about how do we support early career scholars who want to do this work well, to build skills to do good community engaged research. And one role that community engaged research can play in this area is make visible the ways that lived experiences of youth educators, function as funds of knowledge for professional development, and that should be valued as much as some of the scholarly or the book or university-based knowledge is. The last thing that I will say is that we tend to be silent on how ideologies of inequality play out. That when we say young people, we don't tend to acknowledge how ideologies such as racism and sexism and ableism, ideologies related to who comes from which economic class background, how they all play out to distort which young person is deserving of opportunity, which young person is deserving of leadership. And I think this is where some of that work on equity audits was going to be meaningful in the foundation space. I'm thinking of the Equitable Evaluation Initiative, for example, that came through the philanthropy, the landscape, and Jared Hoffman's work, supporting organizations to think, if we make this decision from an equity standpoint, what are the implications on the mechanisms that drive youth engagement? I think philanthropy has a role to shift from sort of telling people what to do, but partnering with communities to lift up the existing funds of knowledge, to open up trajectories for professional development for the youth educators, and lastly, how to support community engaged scholars to be embedded and accompany innovative youth organizations as they try to lift up young people's voices.
Thanks, Andrew. I really hear throughout your first and these remarks, this idea of partnership and everybody sharing knowledge and power together in a collaborative way, the youth, the adults, the teachers, the educators, the philanthropists, that this is not as hierarchical as we often have it be, where there tends to be X has the knowledge and the power and it's flowing downward, but more of a more lateral power structure is what I'm hearing you say. Joe,
Yes.
What would you say are some of the chief barriers to designing really powerful learning experiences, community engagement experiences for young people, either in school or out of school?
So it feels to me like there's a couple things that are getting highlighted here that are really helpful that speak to this, Brian. One, it feels like we're all talking in important ways about the opportunity structure and about thinking about in what ways is that, what are the strengths and the gaps in that opportunity structure, right? Because educators ultimately don't control the outcomes, right? That's an impact of the young person and the experience. But we do control, and funders, as you were mentioning, those folks do control to some extent what supports are we providing in terms of giving young people certain opportunities. So one kind of analysis that feels really important is to assess, who are we reaching with these opportunities and what opportunities are we providing to who? And that feels like an important piece of work if we're going to try to make sure both that we're reaching everybody, that we have a level of equality, and that we also we can assess what we're giving to people. A second element of this, which again I think is true of the civics field generally, but also true in climate, is that many of the people involved, and I don't know this for sure, but sort of scanning the folks as they introduce themselves, we tend to be on the supply side of this. And what I mean by that is we're the folks who design programs, who talk about what should be supplied, what are the qualities of good programming, and we try to, in a sense, pitch ourselves to schools or after-school programs or other foundations to try to supply more. And there's no doubt that supply matters. But I think if our goal is to, in powerful ways, alter the opportunity structure, in other words, if we don't think we're getting enough work done in this space, we have to think a lot, not just about the supply side, but about the demand side. And frankly, if demand increased dramatically, I have no doubt that the supply side would grow to match it, right? Most of these organizations would love to be bigger. So in many respects, our big problem, I would argue, is on the demand side, not on the supply side. Although obviously we have to pay attention to what are the qualities of high quality, of what we're supplying, what we're providing. And so if that's the case, and I do think this has implications for foundations, I think it has implications for government, and I think it has implications for those of us who want to work with those folks to think about how do we shift demand meaningfully to create, in a sense, a driver or a place for that supply. So I think of things like the Civic Seals movement, which is not, this enormous thing, right? But a good number, more than a dozen states now, are providing seals of civic engagement as an opportunity on diplomas. And I know some districts and states are thinking about that specifically focused on climate. And I know that obviously climate work could fit into those, receiving a civic seal. That's not the only answer. I just throw it out there as a tangible possibility. But what I think is exciting about that is it is potentially a driver of demand. Because as districts say, in California, they're looking at putting information about how many kids in your district got the Civic Seal up on the school dashboard. Well, that would drive superintendents who might otherwise be like, who cares, right? Or I care, but this isn't, in the top 20 of the priorities I have to juggle as I'm being pounded with priorities. So it's never going to get my attention. This creates a way for them to care. I'd encourage us as a community to think more on that demand side if we really want to drive this work forward and expand the opportunity structure.
I love that framing of shifting the supply and demand piece, and it gets me thinking, Joe and Katie and Andrew, that right now the demand side is often controlled by our assessment systems, right? How many kids graduate, their test scores, their attendance, et cetera. I know a charter school teacher who just lost a student to suicide, and he's very frustrated. That's a complex issue, suicide, and had a lot of root causes. But one of them was probably the intense focus on testing there and grades and getting into this elite university, immigrant kid and his parents putting pressure on him. And this teachers thought it was a wasted opportunity, that the assessment process in that school didn't see what an amazing young person this was and reinforce that, right? And so you think about those changing the demand side. It also is changing the adults, the accountability structures within schools, and California is doing some leading work on that. Katie, where do you see the opportunities to sort of free up, not just liberate the students, and I see Marilyn from Bezos talking about power. How do we empower and liberate our teachers to look at the full dimensions of our young people and letting them become civic actors? And where are some good examples of that?
Yeah, maybe? I was Haley, I don't know if there's a slide for this, but I'm going to preview some new, I don't know if it's new, but some work that we're doing to really try to start almost categorizing the different, I would say, outcomes and formats of what young people in programs that are represented here and elsewhere are actually already doing. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that work and to just say that we, as part of an NSF funded study right now, we're doing a nationwide look at specifically out of school time programs, and that are really foregrounding and highlighting youth leadership, youth voice, youth perspective as sort of the primary dimension of their work, and trying to sort of do an accounting of what are the different kinds of projects or outcomes of this work. And so far, there are more categories, but I just want to give you some examples of if you wanted to call these impact categories, or I'm not sure exactly what the right term is now, but there's a group of projects that are really doing civic literacy and I would say outreach. And this could be something like, working on voting rights. That's a big issue on my mind because I'm from Tennessee, and so I'm thinking about how youth voice and perspectives are going to be thinking and pushing on that issue right now. Another category is community tools, and so this is a example where the youth led projects are really trying to develop a tool that will be beneficial and useful to the community beyond the lifespan of the project, right? So this could be like a digital app. We've seen like digital cookbooks that are using local food sources as their ingredients. Things like historical walking maps that are really trying to highlight assets of the community, again, that will live on beyond the lifespan of the actual crew that's together. There's a whole cluster of projects that are really, I think, you could call them STEM stewards. So these are projects that maybe there's a local gardening, growing food for neighbors in the area, beekeeping, right, and donating honey to elderly retirement homes. So there's the STEM stewards category, and then I think the commons transformation category is really aspirational. These are the projects that are really making changes on the ground. So young people are collecting data and arguing for bike lanes, and they get these bike lanes, or they're mapping food deserts, and then they change the planning policies such that a grocery store can be built somewhere. So I mean, and they're sort of like environmental restoration projects in that category. So this is kind of like an early look at the mapping that we're doing. I use mapping way too much, but at the audit that we're doing of what programs are really up to right now. And I think this work is so important and transformational, not just for the people that are in the doing the work, but really has lasting benefits for the neighbors and community members and stakeholders that live there. So I just want to acknowledge that this work is happening, and it's not easy. Obviously, it takes a lot. We've been talking about all that it takes and the opportunity, geography, and infrastructure that it takes. But this is amazing work, and I think within these categories, there's ways to expand and maybe change the sort of language around it. But I just wanted to put that out there and say, wow, this is so cool that we're finding all these different projects right now. And I'll turn it over to back to you. Yep.
It gives me definitely a sense of optimism that there's hope and there's pathways that we can act on. And Andrew, what's giving you optimism at this point in time, and what opportunities do you see that we could really take advantage of sooner rather than later?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Brian. I'm thinking about, a while back, Dina Mitra wrote about the role that intermediary organizations play in accompanying program implementers, and I think about more recent work by Veronica Enriquez, Ben Kushner, who are partnering with youth movements. So this idea of research as accompanying movement work and being embedded and studying civic identity development from within the context of the action that young people are taking is really exciting to me. And there is opportunity there from a research perspective for supporting early career scholars to be embedded in these teams, to learn alongside senior scholars and with practitioners. Relatedly, I think what that could do is lift up the voices of practitioners to inform where both research and funding could go. In the youth development field in general, youth civic development especially, we typically tend to prioritize the young person themselves, but the voices of the educators remain on the margins. And here I'll highlight work by Bianca Baldridge, who is lifting up the voices of Black youth workers across the country. Her latest book, Laboring in the Shadows, is highly recommended here. But practitioners are sitting on a lot of wisdom that we tend to ignore as researchers, as funders, as policymakers, and understanding both innovations that are local, whether it's programmatic or curricular innovations, connecting them with each other so that they're building power together is a key opportunity. And leveraging their funds of wisdom to support collective learning, whether it's within an organization or across an ecosystem. And the reason I hop on the collective learning agenda here is that youth adult partnerships is not a thing, that is not a program or a curriculum we implement. It's a way of working. And in the organizations that have established communities of practice to understand what is the mission and vision of these partnerships in our context, what barriers arise in our context, what do we need as practitioners learning from each other, whether it's senior management all the way to a new intern. That kind of collective learning is important. It's always underfunded, and time is usually not on the side of implementing organizations. And so opportunities for collective learning can really support this work. Some two last innovations that I'll talk about. I'll give a shout out to Native Americans in Philanthropy. They have a wonderful youth leadership opportunity that is supporting young people, young Native Americans to reimagine philanthropy and providing training with them. I will have been very privileged to see them in action. And I think they hold a model within philanthropy of what youth engagement can look like. And finally, in my own work, I have a research practice partnership with Silverton School District in rural Colorado, where we are looking at supporting youth leadership development for rural young people, but also how do we support distributed models of leadership at a larger school district level so that these partnerships exist within more supportive contexts. That kind of learning for me holds a lot of potential, and I'm excited to see what it could bring up for the field. From measurement perspectives, how do we have valid measures of what we value, all the way to innovative practice models that can be shared across the ecosystem.
I'm excited by a lot of what you said there, Andrew. And I love the idea of, I once in my running a civic organization had a co-researcher, and it was such a wonderful learning experience for us to be over a multi-year grant that Kellogg funded at the time, to be discussing your work with and the researcher learning from the practitioner and the students simultaneously. It was the richest research environment I had been in, and I just love you calling that out. And the role of intermediaries like Earth Force. By the way, as a board member, 10-second commercial, you can make a difference in civic engagement giving a donation to Earth Force today. If you want to support great design of learning organizations, some of you leave early, so I want to get that plug in first. But I love the intermediary focus and the focus on ecosystems and not in strengthening. You can't just design one minute space and think you're going to change. You have to move the whole ecosystem towards this. And Joe, what have you seen? What are the opportunities in the areas where you see a possibility for ecosystem change? You mentioned California recently, but where do you see some other promising opportunities?
Yeah, so I guess I would start by saying, sort of plus one to what both Katie and Andrew mentioned and to what you were highlighting there, Brian. So I'll try to not just repeat, but I did resonate with what was being shared. You asked about hope or what are the possibilities. I'm going to start with something less hopeful, but then try to respond. I think we'd be, not honest if we didn't say that at the same time there's widespread interest and commitment in these directions, there's definitely a chilling effect going on right now. So as we look at the ecosystem, and we've been doing research on what's happening in districts and what's happening in the out-of-school space, we're seeing that in many environments it's getting harder and harder to pursue these agendas and to pursue them in robust ways, and that's often very much based on geography and very much tied to political ideology, and that's real. So I do think we need to acknowledge that at the same time that we think about how we respond to that, because in many respects, both cutbacks in funding and legal pressures or fear of controversy is chilling what's happening. I do think that with this particular issue, though, we have a couple assets that we can lean into, and I think were mentioned before, but I want to say a bit more about them. And the first is the relevance of locality. That while many people are skeptical of national and broad statements related to, say, climate justice work, few people don't recognize the reality that climate and environmental factors are relevant in their locality. And so, and in many respects, I'd argue, since we're talking about civics, that it's a profoundly democratic move to say to people in their locality what matters to you about the environment. And that in some ways, one of the challenges for our field is that we often think nationally and internationally in the work that we all do. And that may mean that we're centering issues that are not central for a lot of the individuals we're working with. And that may lead to some of the conflicts that legitimize some of the efforts to chill, which I don't want to justify by any stretch of the imagination, but I do think we have to be aware of those dynamics. So I do think, and I know a number of the folks, in the audience here as well as on the panel, do a lot of work locally or with locales, and I think that can be very powerful. The second thing I guess I'd say, and this speaks in a different way to being responsive to local pressures or local priorities, is how do we do a move with some of the standardization and attention to standards that you were talking about and that others have mentioned can be quite problematic and challenging because of the way they're used, while at the same time recognizing the legitimacy of the desire to collect data on what's happening to our kids. And I do think there's a huge messaging challenge, which I think actually the field of civics is getting a bit better at. But one of the challenges is that for a long time, and I'm sure if it had been in the internet age, you could pull out clips of me saying these kinds of things. Civics is important in its own right, enough with whether or not it helps with academic skill. And the challenge of that sentence is that what many people just heard was, you don't care about the thing I'm held accountable for. Mm-hmm. That's not a great movement building move. So what I think, and at the same time, we don't necessarily want to lead into and connect with some of the most detrimental aspects of the testing culture. But I suspect there is some space for common ground that could allow us to expand our movement and strengthen that ecosystem. And that is, for example, that a lot of work on climate science will deepen people's understanding of science. And a lot of work on media literacy and learning how to read about and think about the arguments that are out there related to climate will strengthen their literacy skills, their analytic skills in profound ways. Will give opportunities for learning about how to have conversations across difference, and some things that I think will give us opportunities for project-based learning that will build workforce skills. And I don't think there is a crime in acknowledging that a lot of parents and kids care about whether they're getting workforce skills in a world where it's hard to get a good job. And so I think looking for those places of synergy will create a stronger movement, which will allow us to expand that infrastructure for climate work.
I love this as sort of a lead into the closing question here, because we only have about 6 minutes left. So this is sort of the rapid fire round. And I want to acknowledge the rural. You get extra points in this rapid fire if you can respond to the rural area question of how do we design really good civic engagement experiences in rural areas. But I'll toss in one of on Joe's sense, as I see brain science and some of the work from Mary Helen Imordino Yang on transformational learning and the role of relevant civic engagement, community shaping, problem solving, having that sort of deep emotional work that also leads to transformational learning. And I think it's a good example of how we could hitch our wagon in the civic space to civic research that shows it's moving the whole child indicators. What do you see, Katie and Andrew and Joe, in your, well, let's go in order here because we only have about 2 minutes each. Give me your final thoughts for the practitioner out there, for the researcher out there, the philanthropist of an opportunity or two you're really excited about. And extra points for rural.
Sorry. Okay. Yeah, I'm first. Right. Yeah, I think it's really important, Lee, that you pose this question. I've done a project in a couple of rural places, in which I think the biggest asset there was that many of the adults knew and cared for many of the kids already. There was already, I mean, a really close knit community of caring adults who wanted to see their children not just learn great things, but wanted to like listen to young people on how to make the place better. So the kids stayed around after they graduated, right, and didn't leave. So there was this real sort of, I would say, like intergenerational investment around like making, or I would say following young people's ideas and seeing what was possible, so that young people had a real incentive to stay and have families and grow up and continue growing up in this place. So I think that's a real asset that rural communities really, we need to talk more about that. I just think, yeah. So I'll pass it to Andrew.
Thanks.
Thank you, Katie. I'm right there with you. I think strength-based framing is really important. A key framework that has inspired my own engagement with Silverton School District is the rural cultural wealth framework that says, how do we begin with rural as asset instead of deficit? I will give a shout out to grantee program partners of the Bezos Family Foundation, the Rural Schools Collaborative, that is emphasizing experiential place-based learning, and Sarko at Tufts that has highlighted this idea of civic deserts, which for me, coming back to the adult piece, tension that I see and an opportunity for both research and programming is really understanding how trauma plays into the process of civic engagement. That is a conversation that I'm yet to see happening. How do we understand that not every young person is beginning at the same place when it comes to their civic agency? And what are the assets in the environment, in these spaces that might be leveraged to equalize that playing field? Joe, I'll pass it to you to bring us home.
Thanks.
So I really agree. I think on one level, the principles, the educational principles are the same, be it rural. So, you need to talk to people. You need to start with them. You need to give them space for meaningfully partnering and shaping where you go. I think attending to the differing civic infrastructure in differing communities, and the rural-urban distinction is often profound. So when we're thinking about funding, for example, I'm in California, LA and San Francisco have way more money and way more infrastructure. Doesn't mean they don't have needs. They do, but they have a whole bunch of institutions that just don't exist when you start moving into the more rural parts of the state. And I think we need to be really conscious of that and collect data on that and pay attention to issues of equity and equality so that we build a supportive infrastructure that really is across the country, not located close to where many of us live.
I had a feeling when we did this conversation that we could go for 3 hours or 3 days and still not have enough time to talk about everything. And I apologize to the audience. We're going to take questions from the audience, but we had just a lot to say on this. So I think next time, Vince Meldrum at EarthForce, maybe we do a 90-minute or 2-hour conversation so we can really get full audience participation. But I just want to thank our three researchers, Joe, Katie, and Andrew, for taking time to share with us. and just how important it is, the topic of designing these meaningful experiences, how good EarthForce, our sponsor, is at doing that. And then just in the spirit of that we heard again and again is how important it is for the research community to partner with the folks on the ground and with the philanthropic community to really make this work happen. And I'd add the community organizing communities as well. So thanks for all of you, and hope the audience enjoyed this engagement. Please send us a line, and please dig into the deep research that Katie, Andrew, and Joe are doing in their fields. There's so much more to learn from them. Take care. Have a great day, you all.